Brandon Fugal has never evacuated Skinwalker Ranch. Through 5 seasons of aerial phenomenon, underground discoveries, crew hospitalizations, and instrument readings that dismantled every conventional explanation his scientific team applied to them, the investigation kept moving, until the drilling operation reached something that responded, not resisted, responded, and Brandon Fugal made a decision that nobody in the investigation's history has ever made before. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because what responded to that drill changed everything. Brandon Fugal's ownership of Skinwalker Ranch has been defined by a single operational commitment that has distinguished his investigation from every prior program that engaged seriously with the property: the commitment to continuation, where the Sherman family eventually reached the limit of what sustained exposure to the ranch's phenomenon could ask of a family trying to maintain an ordinary life, and sold. Where the NIDS program eventually exhausted the resources and the institutional patience that Robert Bigelow's private funding could sustain and wound down. Where the AAWSAP initiative eventually reached the point at which the classified research program's findings had produced a body of evidence that the government determined required management rather than continued investigation, and discontinued. Fugal kept going. The investigation he built around the property was designed specifically to outlast the forces that had stopped every prior program: the financial pressure, the institutional resistance, the personal toll, and the specific quality of sustained anomalous exposure that the ranch produces in the people who spend serious time on it. The monitoring infrastructure he installed runs continuously. The scientific team he assembled has the professional credentials to withstand the institutional skepticism that prior programs encountered. The broadcast format he chose gives the investigation a public accountability that private programs never had. Every design decision was oriented toward the same outcome, keeping the investigation moving regardless of what the ranch produced. That commitment has been tested across 5 seasons. The aerial phenomenon that defies every aerodynamic principle, the investigation's aerospace credentialed team applies to it. The underground structures whose geometric consistency no geological model accounts for. The crew members whose medical evacuations documented physical effects that attending physicians could not attribute to any known environmental cause. The instrument readings whose values Travis Taylor has been choosing every public word about with the specific care of a physicist who knows what his data is showing and understands the implications of stating it plainly. Through all of it, the investigation kept moving. The evacuation that this video documents is the first time in 5 seasons of investigation that the decision to stop, not pause, not suspend a session, but evacuate, was made. What produced that decision is what the drilling operation reached. And what the drilling operation reached responded to being reached in a way that made evacuation the only responsible choice. The Skinwalker Ranch drilling operation is the investigation's most direct attempt to physically access the underground formation that the sonar and ground-penetrating radar work of the middle seasons established as the property's most significant and most anomalous feature. The sonar returns from beneath the mesa that produced the investigation's first clear picture of the underground environment, identified significant structured voids at depths whose geometry was inconsistent with natural cave formation, too consistent in their proportions, too regular in their arrangement, and too specifically located at positions corresponding to the surface zones of maximum electromagnetic anomaly to be accounted for by the natural dissolution processes that produce cave systems in comparable geological environments. The drilling operation was designed to close the distance between the investigation's instrument-based knowledge of the underground formation and the physical reality of what the instruments had been mapping. The approach methodology developed across the operation's prior attempts, the lateral entry angles that avoided the direct vertical descents whose resistance events had terminated earlier drilling efforts, the geological assessments that identified the formation boundary zones where penetration was most viable, and the instrument monitoring that tracked the formation's response to the drilling in real time, had produced progressively more successful approaches to the underground structures with each season's operational iteration. The resistance that the formation had produced in response to prior drilling attempts had been the most consistent evidence that whatever was underground was not indifferent to the investigation above it. Equipment failures at specific depths, whose mechanical analysis produced no conventional explanation, flooding events that filled bore holes precisely when the drilling reached the depth boundaries of the most significant underground features, electromagnetic interference that disabled drilling instrumentation in the approach zones with a timing and a specificity that correlated directly with the underground formation's mapped position. All of that prior resistance had been calibrated to the capability of the drilling operation that produced it, increasing in intensity as the operation's methodology improved and decreasing in specificity as the operation operations approach changed in ways that apparently required adjustment. The evacuation that this video documents occurred because the most recent drilling approach did not encounter resistance in the pattern the prior attempts had established. It encountered something different, not the familiar resistance of the formation pushing back against the approach, something that the formation did in response to the drilling reaching a specific point in the underground structure that was not resistance in any conventional sense. It was response. And the distinction between those two things is the most significant thing about what the drilling operation just reached. The drilling session that produced the response whose documentation led to the evacuation decision was not approached as a routine operational advancement of the prior approach methodology. It was approached as the most significant drilling session in the investigation's history because the instrument data from the monitoring infrastructure running continuously across the property in the weeks preceding the session had been showing changes in the underground formation's detectable characteristics that the technical team had assessed as indicating a shift in the formation's state, rather than a continuation of the escalating pattern the prior season's monitoring had established. The electromagnetic readings from the active zones above the formation had reorganized in the geographic distribution pattern that the geophysicist's assessment had characterized as consistent with a change in the source geometry of whatever was generating the surface anomalies. The vibration signatures from the underground sensors had been showing the repeating temporal structure whose mechanical precision the prior assessment had established as inconsistent with any geological process in the reference literature. And the perimeter monitoring data had been producing readings whose correspondence to the approach vector established in the prior perimeter sweep analysis indicated that whatever was operating across the broader Uinta Basin had been increasing its activity in the specific section of the property whose underground position corresponded to the drilling operation's current target. The session began with the full monitoring infrastructure running at its maximum deployment configuration, every instrument category active, every camera unit positioned, and the scientific team's full analytical attention directed at the real-time data stream from the sensors closest to the drilling operation's current approach position. The first hour of the session produced instrument readings that the technical team's field notes characterize as the most concentrated simultaneous anomaly across multiple independent measurement categories that the investigation had recorded at any prior drilling session. Not individually the most extreme readings the investigation had ever logged. Specific prior sessions had produced higher peak values in individual instrument categories, but the simultaneous elevation across every instrument category at once, in a spatial distribution that the technical team's analysis established as centered on the drilling operation's current position, was a pattern whose character was different from the escalating response pattern the prior sessions had produced. Something was paying attention to exactly where the drill was, and then the drill reached the depth that produced the response. The specific depth at which the drilling operation produced the response that led to the evacuation corresponds to the upper boundary of the primary void structure that the sonar mapping had identified as the most significant underground feature beneath the mesa, the feature whose dimensions, geometric consistency, and electromagnetic correspondence with the surface anomaly distribution had made it the primary target of the drilling operation's progressive approach across multiple seasons. What happened when the drill reached that depth is what Travis Taylor's description of the session, delivered in the specific language of a physicist whose professional discipline demands precision about what the measurements established and restraint about what they implied, characterizes as unlike anything the investigation's monitoring infrastructure had previously recorded at any depth in any prior drilling session. The electromagnetic readings across the monitoring network did not spike in the escalating resistance pattern the prior sessions had established as the formation's response to the drilling approach. They shifted simultaneously across every sensor in the network in a coordinated pattern whose geographic distribution changed from the locally elevated distribution that the approach had been producing to a basin-wide elevation that the network's full geographic extent captured at once, every sensor simultaneously, shifting from a locally concentrated pattern to a basin-wide one in a transition whose speed the monitoring data documents as occurring between consecutive data points in the recording, present in one configuration in one data frame, present in a different configuration in the next, with no transitional period. The acoustic sensors registered the simultaneous transition in the infrasound range, a shift from the repeating temporal structure the prior monitoring had been logging to a single sustained signal whose frequency and whose internal structure the audio specialist characterized in real time as unlike anything in the prior investigation's acoustic record. The ground vibration sensors logged a signature at the target depth that was not the mechanical vibration of the drilling equipment encountering geological resistance. It was something else, something that the vibration analysis characterizes as emanating from within the void structure, rather than from the geological material surrounding it. A signature consistent with a large-scale physical event occurring inside the underground space rather than in the formation surrounding. The source of that event is inside the underground structure that the drilling operation had just reached the boundary of, and the event's occurrence in direct temporal correspondence with the drill reaching that boundary is what produced the response designation rather than the resistance designation in the investigation team's characterization of what the session documented. The 11 minutes between the drill reaching the target depth and Brandon Fugal making the evacuation decision are documented in the investigation's complete session record across every instrument category and every camera unit running at the time. What those 11 minutes contain, the specific sequence of developments in the monitoring data, the physical environment of the property, and the investigation team's direct experience of what was occurring at the session site, is the body of evidence on which the evacuation decision was based and whose character Fugal has characterized in the limited public references to the session as unlike anything in 5 seasons of investigation at the most anomalous property in American research history. The electromagnetic shift that occurred when the drill reached the target depth did not stabilize at its new basin-wide configuration. It continued changing, not returning toward the prior localized distribution but moving further from it, with the basin-wide elevation increasing in intensity across the full monitoring network in a directional movement whose rate the technical team's real-time analysis characterized as accelerating rather than approaching a new equilibrium. Whatever the drilling had triggered was not producing a one-time response and returning to its prior state. It was building. The thermal monitoring at the property surface documented a temperature anomaly that developed in the Mesa zone in the minutes following the drill's depth breakthrough, an elevation in the ambient thermal environment of the Mesa's surface whose magnitude and whose geographic extent the prior monitoring baseline identified as without precedent in the investigation's surface thermal record. The Mesa was warming, not dramatically. The differential was measurable rather than immediately perceptible to the investigators present, but measurable across the full surface extent of the Mesa formation in a pattern consistent with heat transmission from below, from something in the underground formation that had changed its thermal state in correspondence with the drilling reaching its boundary. The physical effects on the investigation team members present at the session site in the 11 minutes following the depth breakthrough are the element of the evacuation record that Fugal has been most careful about in his public references to the session. Multiple team members reported effects whose character and whose timing, corresponding directly to the onset of the electromagnetic shift and the thermal anomaly, placed them in the category of the investigation's documented physical effect events. Not dramatic, not acute in the way that prior crew medical incidents had been acute, but present, simultaneous across multiple individuals, and developing in intensity across the 11-minute window in a progression that the investigation's accumulated experience with the physical effects of the ranch's active zones gave Fugal the specific context to assess as requiring a response before the progression continued further. Brandon Fugal made the evacuation decision at the 11-minute mark of the post-breakthrough monitoring window. The decision was not made through a formal consultation process or a committee review of the session data. It was made by Fugal directly, communicated to the session team immediately, and implemented without the deliberation that decisions of comparable operational significance in the investigation's prior history had typically involved. The speed of the decision reflects something about the character of what the 11 minutes had produced in a man whose 5 seasons of sustained engagement with the most anomalous property in American research history had given him a reference framework for assessing when the investigation was operating within conditions it was equipped to manage and when it was not. Fugal's reference framework has been built across 5 seasons of decisions about how far to push the investigation in response to what the ranch produces. Decisions whose accumulated record across the broadcast seasons communicates a consistent judgment that the investigation should advance toward whatever the ranch generates rather than away from it. He has made that judgment in the face of crew medical incidents, equipment destructions, aerial encounters, and underground resistance events whose cumulative effect on the investigation's operational context has been absorbed and continued. What the 11 minutes following the drill's depth breakthrough produced in Fugal that made the evacuation decision different from every prior decision in the investigation's history is the distinction that makes the evacuation significant. The prior decisions, the decisions to keep moving in the face of everything the ranch had produced, were made in the context of a phenomenon that was producing its outputs in the investigation's vicinity, without directing them at the investigation specifically. The 11 minutes following the depth breakthrough produced something whose character the monitoring data and the direct experience of the team members present established as directed. The Basin-wide electromagnetic shift, the Mesa thermal anomaly, the simultaneous physical effects on multiple team members, their simultaneous onset in direct correspondence with the drilling reaching the target depth, their progressive intensification across the 11-minute window, and their geographic concentration on the investigation's specific position all indicated a response whose source was aware of exactly where the drilling operation was and was producing its outputs in direct correspondence with what the drilling had done. Fugal evacuated because the investigation had produced something that was responding to it rather than simply occurring around it, and the appropriate response to a phenomenon that has demonstrated awareness of your investigation is to assess what you have documented before continuing to do the thing that produced the response. Travis Taylor's analysis of the session data from the drilling response event is the scientific foundation on which the investigation's understanding of what the 11 minutes documented is being built. And his characterization of what the analysis has produced is the most significant scientific communication about the Skinwalker Ranch investigation that has been made in the public record since his involvement with the property began. Taylor applied his full professional methodology to the session data, the systematic process of conventional explanation elimination, whose output he treats as the necessary precondition for entertaining unconventional interpretation, and whose application to the Skinwalker Ranch evidence across 5 seasons has progressively reduced the range of conventional explanations available for what the investigation's instruments have been detecting. The electromagnetic shift analysis produced the finding that Taylor has characterized in his public references to the session with the most direct language he has applied to any single piece of Skinwalker Ranch evidence across his seasons on the property. The simultaneous basin-wide reconfiguration of the electromagnetic monitoring network's readings in the interval between consecutive data points is not consistent with any electromagnetic propagation mechanism in the physical literature. Electromagnetic fields do not reorganize instantaneously across geographic scales of the magnitude the session data documents. The propagation of electromagnetic effects through any medium occurs at finite velocity, at the speed of light through vacuum, at reduced velocities through conductive and lossy media. The monitoring network's geographic extent is large enough that instantaneous reconfiguration across its full span is not physically possible through any known electromagnetic mechanism. What the data shows happened is not something that known physics permits. Taylor's characterization of that finding, delivered in the restrained, precisely chosen language that his professional discipline demands, is the closest he has come in 5 seasons of public communication about the ranch's evidence to saying plainly that what the investigation's instruments documented is operating outside the known physical framework. The vibration analysis produced a complementary finding whose implication Taylor characterizes with comparable directness. The source of the vibration signature logged at the target depth is inside the underground void structure, not in the geological material at the void's boundary, inside the void. Something inside the underground space that the drilling operation reached the boundary of produced a physical event in direct temporal correspondence with the drilling reaching that boundary. The event's characteristics are documented. Its source location is established. Its correspondence with the drilling's depth breakthrough is beyond coincidence in the statistical sense. What produced it, what is inside that underground space, and why the drilling reaching its boundary produced the response the session documented, is the question that the investigation's next phase must answer. Taylor's analysis has established what the question is with more precision than any prior season's investigation has achieved. Answering it is what the evacuation bought time to prepare for. The evacuation is not a conclusion. Fugal has been explicit. The investigation has not stopped. The property has not been abandoned, and the drilling operation has not been terminated. What the evacuation produced is a pause whose purpose is the development of a revised operational framework that reflects what the session established about the nature of what the underground formation does when the drilling reaches its primary boundary. The prior framework was designed around a formation that resisted. The new framework must be designed around a formation that responds. Those are different operational challenges. The response profile the session documented, the instantaneous basin-wide electromagnetic reconfiguration, the simultaneous Mesa thermal output, the concurrent physical effects on multiple team members, constitutes a detailed picture of what the formation produces when its boundary is reached. The boundary penetration that comes next will be the most significant single operational decision in the investigation's history. What happens when the drilling enters the interior of the underground space is unknown. The evacuation bought time to prepare for that unknown, with the full weight of what the session established about what is waiting on the other side. 5 seasons of Skinwalker Ranch investigation documented a phenomenon that resisted. Resistance is passive, the phenomenon declining to be reached. What the drilling session documented is not resistance. It is response. Active, directed, calibrated to the specific action that produced it, and produced at a scale the prior resistance events never approached. The distinction matters more than anything the investigation has previously established. A phenomenon that resists can be mapped and progressively understood. A phenomenon that responds has demonstrated awareness specific enough to produce directed output in correspondence with a specific action at a specific location. Whatever is inside the underground formation knows the drilling reached its boundary. It responded to prove it. The evacuation is the investigation's acknowledgement of what that demonstration means. The drilling that goes back into the ground will go back knowing that what is on the other side of the boundary knows it is coming. That knowledge is the most significant thing 5 seasons of Skinwalker Ranch investigation has ever produced. And what the drilling finds when it crosses the boundary with that knowledge is what every prior season has been building toward.